So we're here today to try to accomplish two things in the next hour. We would like to let you know what this community that you worship in looked like about 110 to 120 years ago. That's the first part. We're going to be showing mostly what this road on the Bay Road looked like, and then up here a little bit. And then we're going to quickly go through some of the highlights of the first 50 years or so of Zion. We don't have enough time to go through 118 years of Zion here today. So we're going to take some of the notable things that happened really early on, before most of us were walking around here at this church. So we're going to start with Pleasant Valley. And one thing I wanted to start with was to say that if you were out traveling out of town somewhere and somebody said to you, "Where do you worship?" or "Where do you live?" you might give them different answers, because they probably weren't somebody that was living or worshiping here with you. So you might say, "Well, it's near Ferndale." Or you might say, "Well, we're in the Custer area." Does that sound about right?
Yeah. Custer areas.
The Custer area.
Right.
It's been used a lot.
How many of you would have said, "Well, I worship in Pleasant Valley"? How many would say that these days? Probably not anybody, because most people, including some of the folks who are newer to this region, don't necessarily even know that this was a rural community that was Pleasant Valley, and known as Pleasant Valley for several reasons. Just like if you lived east on the Bay Road, where it curves over towards the cemetery, you were living in the Enterprise neighborhood. That's how the cemetery got its name. Not because somebody wanted to have a strange name for a cemetery, but it was a community that had a school, and it had, for a very short while, in the early days, it had a place of commerce, a little store. If you lived north of us, a couple miles, like the Myers do, 110 years ago, you might have said, "Well, I live in the California Creek District." They had a school down there, and they had a church in that area. So we have a lot of communities that are kind of lost in the mindset, because in the old days, say 1900 or 1910 or even 1920, most people still didn't have automobiles around here. Maybe you did if you were closer to town because the roads were better. But out here, if you lived here in 1900, you worshiped around here. You didn't drive 10 miles away to go to a church. You sent your kids to the neighborhood two-room schoolhouse, where they had to walk to it. They didn't get bused to Custer or Ferndale. If you had a job besides your farm, it was probably related to this community. Maybe you worked in the logging industry, or maybe you did a little fishing on the side, or maybe you worked as a contractor for a road contractor. Most of your life revolved around the community that you lived in. And all that, everything changed with automobiles, as you might guess. So we're talking about pre-automobile days. So what kind of things what kind of characteristics did you find in a rural community over a century ago? Well, first and foremost, it probably had to do with school. 100 years ago, if you could drop out of a hot air balloon up in the air somewhere in this area and parachute down, wherever you landed, you were probably only about 4 miles or less from a school. somewhere. We had schools, of course, in Pleasant Valley, and we'll show you some good pictures of that. I mentioned that California Creek had a school, Enterprise had a school, Birch Bay had a school, Whitehorn, which is where I came from, which is now better known as BP Refinery, they had a school, and they actually had a Lutheran church out there too. And so there was a school up here right below Leonard on the corner of North Star and Grandview. That was called the Grandview one. You had a school out on Alder Grove Road. You had a North Star district. That was a North Star neighborhood. My mother went to North Star. She had to walk 2 miles across fields to get to the North Stars. Now, most of these schools disappeared. Almost all of them disappeared by the 30s. And these little schools closed up. The kids were then bused to Custer, or if you were north farther, maybe Blaine, or maybe Ferndale if you lived towards south of here. The other things that were common in a rural community, everybody was on a farm. Almost everybody had a working farm. Maybe not so big, maybe it wasn't even profitable, but most farms were from probably 20 acres to 80 acres, and a few were maybe 160 originally. But they were mostly small farmers, and that kept them alive. They could raise a few animals, they could grow a garden, and so they could survive. Logging was huge from about the time this area started being settled around 1880 until about 1910. Most of the fields that you see open now were probably open by 1920. Logging really came and went fairly quick as things go. The biggest thing was shingle mills. Tom Long's mother, she was a Bruin. She grew up on the Bay Road. She recited once to her family, when she was much older, that when she was young, this would have been around 1910, she could remember counting there were 23 shingle mills just along the Kickerville Road. Whoa. From where it starts up north, and it probably goes, I'm guessing 7 or 8, 9 miles, or it did then. It got shortened when Talbot came in. 23 shingle mills, just shingle mills. And then you had lumber mills, and you had some shakes too. And then another thing was general store. There were stores. And so of these 5, Pleasant Valley had all of these things. Most communities didn't have a store. Some had churches. Everybody had a school. School is what really defined your community. So that's, and one other thing that I thought of after I made this slide, can you tell me what all of these communities had in common in their very earliest days? I'm going to just run through the list real quick. Ferndale, Blaine, Hillsdale, that's a name you probably haven't heard in a while. That's the cemetery. Hillsdale is the cemetery along California Creek, and that was actually a little community. Haney, Enterprise, Mountain View, Birch Bay, and Pleasant Valley. They all had a postmaster, meaning they had somebody in their community who volunteered to be a postmaster, which meant that maybe once a week or so he would be receiving mail from either Ferndale or Custer for his community. And he would work out of his home. And so before rural free delivery came along, much later, that's how people used the post office. They would walk down to the guy or gal in their community, who was the postmaster, they would collect the mail. They'd wait around until somebody from Ferndale or Custer came in to pick it up, and they would send it out about once a week. And vice versa, things came in to them, and then they would wait for the neighbors to come in and pick up their mail at the postmaster's house. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Pleasant Valley's first postmaster in a little bit.
And the house he lived in?
And the house he lived in, yeah. So I hope you have your walking shoes on, because we're going to do a real quick walk starting down the Bay Road at the corner of Blaine and Bay. This picture might jog your memory where that would be. And then we're going to follow the Bay Road pretty much all the way to this corner and a little bit beyond. So that's, I don't know, 3.5 miles or so. And when we're done with that, then we'll get into Zion a little bit. So this is what you find at that corner now. And in 1910, this was a picture of the fellow that owned the land, and he had a big field of potatoes in those days. And this was Orrin Lewis, and Orrin Lewis had actually married into this land and the property and the house when he married a young school teacher by the name of Winnie Grimmett. And her parents are the ones who originally owned the land and built the house, which was this one.
Ooh.
And the Grimmetts had come out from Indiana. Mr. Grimmett actually was born in England, but he moved to Indiana by 1860 or so, and then he decided he was going to join the Union Army and fight and support the Union in the Civil War. So Orrin Lewis's father-in-law, Grimmett, was one of at least 2 people that lived along the Bay Road who had been veterans of the Civil War. And that's what the houses look like in more recent years. These now pictures that I have are probably 10 years old now, but it gives you an idea. I mean, that house has not changed a whole lot. And the barn still is pretty much the same as well today. And they both look really good. Now, so if you continue east about a half a mile up the Bay Road, this is what you would see today. Actually, I think there's even a little house or building next to the tracks today. But if you went back to about 1904, there was a dance hall there. The dance hall was on about 1 acre that had been deeded by Orrin Lewis. He had 80 acres, and it ran all the way to that railroad track. So he gave an acre of it to some sort of confederation that was created by this Pleasant Valley band. And this picture was taken soon after they had gotten uniforms. Now, the Pleasant Valley band, I don't know how long they lasted as a band, but after they came about, then there were other bands in the community that were developed. And the 3 bands would start kind of touring each other's neighborhoods. There was one in Blaine and there was one in Birch Bay. And so sometimes one of the other ones would come in and perform at this dance hall. So there was live music there, and this building disappeared. I think it burned down, as best as Tom Long can recollect, probably when he was very young, so that would mean in the 20s. But they had fiddle music there. There were a few people that liked to play the fiddle, and they had dances there into the 20s. So then if you just start walking from the tracks towards the corner, Kickerville corner, still going east, in 1905, this picture was taken by a professional photographer. And this shows you the corner. The building on the right looks like a church. It is a church. That's a congregational church. And it was only about 3 years old. There's a little building behind it, which is the parsonage. Then more towards the center left, that building is still here. That was a store. That was a general store that opened up about the same time as the church, about 1901. And so this is only 2 or 3 years later. And then the L-shaped building with the little bell tower on the left is the Pleasant Valley School. Well, it's one of the Pleasant Valley schools. This was actually the second Pleasant Valley School. And nobody remembers that building anymore because it was replaced in 1916 by a big 2-story and a basement building, which some of us old-timers, even me as a kid, remember that quite well. And a lot of you will remember that building too. And
Now, is that back in the woods back in there?
no, not really. It was pretty close to, there was a little gravel parking lot, maybe 50 feet deep off of the road, but it was fairly close to the road. That's the Congregational Church, which the building stuck around until about the same time as the last school did, which was about 1972 when they both got knocked over. But it kind of had its biggest heyday probably in the 20s, and they usually shared a pastor with the Congregational Church in Blaine. They probably never had a dedicated one parish pastor for that church. That's kind of a close-up of the store around 1905, give or take. And now you see some power poles there, and actually what those are, there actually were there were lines on both sides of the Bay Road in the early days. They weren't electricity. One was a telegraph and one was a telephone. So I'm not sure what you're seeing there, but they didn't have power through Pleasant Valley until mid to late 20s. And this again is the second schoolhouse. The first schoolhouse was this, I call it kind of a glorified woodshed. The school district was created real early. It says school district number 3. This was an autonomous school district. It wasn't connected to any other schools. Custer didn't even exist yet. And so it actually, as I understand it, it was actually the third school in the county, period, that qualified, that had been registered, and the state recognized it as district number 3. But for several years, school happened rather infrequently, maybe a few months in the winter mostly, and kids went around to a few different people's homes who volunteered to house the kids for school during the day. So they didn't actually build this until 7 years later. Now here's the one that, how many people can remember the school building? We've got a few hands. I think Leonard has a pretty good recollection of it too. As you can see, it's really not very far off the pavement there. And this one was taken, well, the way I would read this, I don't see any electricity coming into the building yet, so I would say it's 20s, maybe a little earlier. And they had a lot of kids there. At this time, they might have even had kids up through the 10th grade. For most of its history, it went not kindergarten, 1st through 8th grade. And in its later years, there got to be too many kids to house all the children 1st through 8, so they cut it down to about 1 through 5 in its last few years. And at that point, after you got out of here, then depending on kind of which way you lived from this corner, you either got bused into Blaine or the Custer School District. But Pleasant Valley, like all these other little one-room schoolhouses long ago, they were all actually autonomous school districts until they really couldn't afford to keep going. Well, sometimes they would consolidate and still remain a schoolhouse for a while. But sooner or later, their time was up and the schools were not used anymore. They had a full basement with a kitchen downstairs. They had 2 classrooms on the main floor and 2 classrooms upstairs. And they actually had a stage and a little gathering area for school events and community events.
And exactly where was that located?
It was located right behind that power pole on the corner, just to the right of that semi-truck.
Oh, okay.
That little clearing there. That's where the building was.
Is there anything left of that?
No,
It's not completely gone.
no. Getting ahead of myself here. So this was
Zion
taken.
had summer school at that Pleasant Valley building there.
Right. Do you remember that would have been when you were a kid, a teenager, maybe a young man?
Yeah, it's been about
In the 40s.
70 years at least
Yeah.
back.
Probably in the 40s sometime. Yeah, they did. This church got so full of kids that when they had a summer Bible school, there were a few years, and your mother was one of the teachers, was she not, at Bible school. And so they would open this up for community events and gatherings like that at the school. And the school closed in 39, and there were, I believe, 5 grades left at that time. The 2 teachers they had, they moved to Custer and they continued to teach in Custer. Mrs. Ray Doubt was one of the teachers. Some of you know Mrs. Doubt. And so the kids, again, they got scattered. A lot of them went to Custer and some probably north towards Myers Place. You might have been, I'm not sure. You might have been in the Blaine district then. I'm not sure.
We've always been in the Ferndale, but it's right on the line.
You're kind of right on the line.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And so at this point, in 1939, this store was owned by Mel and Helen Jensen. And some of you that have been around this community a long time would remember that at least Helen and maybe even Mel, they lived to be pretty old. And they were lifetime members here. They're both on our Hall of Fame confirmation pictures here, like a few of you are. And Leonard is too. 1947, I think. You're on there.
Oh.
So the Jensens were both confirmed different years, but in the mid to late 20s. Helen lived over on the Brown Road, and she actually wound up going to Blaine schools. And Melvin lived on the Bay Road, and we'll show you more about that in just a little bit. So they owned the store for several years, probably into the late 40s or so, from the 30s into the 40s.
Well, that looks like a cement road.
It was a cement road.
And I see a power pole back there, so.
Yeah, this is in 39.
Okay.
Yep. So that store really didn't change a whole lot into the time when I remember it, in the 60s.
When we moved there during Merwin, we're still buying groceries there.
Oh, yeah.
We moved in 72 and we bought groceries in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And they had a meat market,
They did. They had a locker.
a locker.
Mel Jensen is the one who put the meat locker in there. And Don and Luella Herb had the store for a long time. They had it longer than anybody else, probably 18 years, give or take. They were the last ones to have it when it closed in the mid-70s. But yeah, it was a cement pavement that was put in the 20s. And yeah, it was laid in these big squares, as you can see, and so when you went down the pavement at 40, 50 miles an hour, you went gunk, 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 gunk. And it sounded like you're on a train track almost. So you would probably, if you could take some of the recoatings off of that pavement now, you'd come to concrete. That base is still there. So that unfortunately is a somewhat more recent picture with no sign of the schools.
Did it burn?
No, it got knocked over. It was just a matter of economics. It was, the roof leaked. I remember the roof leaking all the time when I would go to it. It was a, I guess I didn't get to the part where it was alive. There was one classroom in there that about 1946, Whatcom County made an extension of their library service in one classroom of the school, of the big school that we saw. And you would go, and you were in just a small classroom that was only about, not even half the size of this area right here. It was like a big bedroom, basically. But I remember on rainy days, they had buckets in there around the books because the roof just leaked a lot by the time I was a kid. You couldn't heat the place very well at all. They would have these little barn heaters sitting on the floor here and there to try to keep the library warm. So it just got too expensive to keep it up. And it was probably one of those things where it wasn't quite old enough that it seemed to be a treasure worth saving. You know how you kind of have to get through a difficult stage first of old buildings before people will say, hey, maybe we ought to reinvest in that and do something with it. Well, it never got to that stage, so it was just knocked down.
Bob, was Clara Whelan the librarian there?
She was. Clara was the main librarian there from the very beginning. For several years. That's right. She was a long time Pleasant Valley, Kickerville Road gal.
Yeah.
Arnie Road.
Pardon me?
Wasn't she on the Arnie Road?
Was she on the Arnie Road? I never
I
actually.
think she was.
Was she on the Arnie Road? Yeah.
Yeah, the dead end up to
Right.
the east, I think.
So how are we doing for time? Okay.
They tore that,
You gotta talk
roof off
faster.
that building, from one time, the top story was haywire, and they took it down and put another roof on it.
So they actually removed the top story and dropped it then.
And that's what I heard.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too. You've got a good memory. So if you're at the corner of Pleasant Valley, as I like to call it, and if you head south on Kickerville Road, you start to go up a little incline, and about a quarter mile up that road, on your left, was the Woolridge house. And it was just being completed. It looks like construction was almost done when this was taken in 1905. And it's just a beautiful old house. I remember 15 years ago when I was talking to some of the old timers that were still around. They had all been in this house as young people. And the first thing they would say when they commented about the house was, oh, they had the most beautiful burl wood. They weren't sure if it was burl wood or oak, but the most beautiful staircase in that house. And the house had a bad ending. It was kind of abandoned in the 60s, and there was a fire that was started, and a good part of it burned, and so they finally just knocked it over.
Is that where the water tank is now?
That's exactly right. Now that's what you see there right now. You probably remember that water tank. Now, another reason I have Woolridge on there is because he was a man of evidently some means, some wealth when he moved here, because he bought some property over on the Brown Road, kind of across the street, across the road from the current fire station, only a little bit east where Terrell Creek crosses the road, 100 or 200 yards east of the fire station. And he built this. He built the largest lumber and shingle mill that was in our community, greater community. And it had a mill pond, 2 kilns, a cookhouse, bunkhouse, horse barn, office, and several family shacks.
Wow.
And so this was a big time operation. They ran railroad tracks down to Cherry Point, so they could, when they had their finished product, they could train it down to the Cherry Point where it was put on barges and taken into Bellingham. So that was a big deal around the community until about 1920 or so, when it burned. Mills usually wound up burning. So now we're going to go back up to the corner where everything happens in Pleasant Valley, and we're going to continue east. And we're going to go about a half a mile east. So we're on the Bay Road, what we call the Bay Road. This was actually called the Ferndale-Blaine Road, because this was the main route, believe it or not, before the old Portal Bay Highway was built. This was the main route from Ferndale to Blaine. We went up what we call Vista Drive, and it passed the Enterprise Cemetery. It bends into the Bay Road now, and then it bends again into the Blaine Road. That was all called the Ferndale-Blaine Road, or the Ferndale-Blaine Highway, even before it was paved. That was it. Anyway, the house on the left belonged to the family of R.C. Bruland, and they became longtime members here, and we'll talk a little bit more about Bruland in a second. And on your right, if you could look over to the right a little bit farther, you would see this farm, and this farm was settled in the 1880s by the Creasy family. This was the Creasy family before they became known as Custer folks.
Yeah.
The Creasys came from England, and Henry Creasy was a coal miner. And they moved out here in the 1870s to the States and finally worked their way here and built this and the beautiful big barn. The barn has been leveled 25 years ago, but the house still stands. But it doesn't look as good as it did. So now we're going to continue down the road a little bit farther, and we're getting kind of close to looking over to our right and saying hi to Marge Andrus. Because she would have been somewhere here. Maybe I've gone a little bit past your driveway. I'm not quite sure.
I don't think so.
But pretty close. And this house up here is still here. This is that big old farmhouse right up on the corner as you look to your right, up on that little hill right above the corner on this on the east, the southeast corner. That was the Hicks family, and the Hicks came real early in the 1880s. Mr. Hicks was the first one who actually started up a stage with a wagon and horses that went from Ferndale to Blaine. So at least he was in charge of part of the stage. I don't know if he managed the whole thing. Possibly he managed the part that went from his place on into Blaine and back. I don't know. But another thing about the Hicks is that being on the corner of what we now call the Bay Road and the Valley View Road, the Valley View Road wasn't always called that. It was called the Hicks Road.
Forever.
Forever. Some old timers tell me it was somewhere probably a little after World War II before it changed the name. Just like Vista Drive wasn't called Vista Drive. That's a fairly new name. And the Bruce Road was named for a son of one of the people who lived out here later. But that was called the Custer School Road, I believe. But anyway, I also show you this picture not only because Marge lives back here on this long driveway, but somewhere around here, we don't have a picture of it, but the Pleasant Valley postmaster lived here in the late 1880s, and his name was Albert W. Custer.
Oh.
Now this is before there was a town of Custer. Custer was created a year or two later only because the train tracks decided to run through the flatlands down there from Ferndale to Blaine. And so when people got wind that that was going to happen, well, some people decided, well, we're going to beat the land barons to the punch, and we're going to buy property and settle there before real estate goes sky high, because there's going to be a train going down there, and they knew there was going to be a depot down there. So he was actually the first postmaster in Pleasant Valley. Now, the irony of that is that some people, and even some of the early newspaper publications, referred to this community as the Custer community. Sometimes it wasn't as, but it was always known as Pleasant Valley, but sometimes people would call it the Custer community because of the postmaster. But he wound up moving down and becoming the first postmaster in what became called Custer, so it was named after him. So when we get back up close to the corner where the Hicks house was, we also come across, and this is not a 1905 picture, this is more like 1941. This is Mel Jensen and Helen Jensen and their two children, Clary and Barbara. Yeah, Clary's on the right, a little older boy. And some of you you may not have known the Jensen family, but if you're familiar with Jensen's Floral in Ferndale, that was started over 60 years ago, actually with the backing of Mel Jensen, and he had his son Clary pretty much run that business, and it's Clary's business, and he's
Still doing
alive.
it. Still alive.
Yeah, I talked to him a few weeks ago. He's about 83 now,
Yeah.
and he's kind of pretty much retired.
And Barbara lives in Linden.
Right, I think she still does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they had a third son later named
Leslie.
Leslie.
Yeah. So I should have got a close up of this. You see this little tower poking up between the two here? That's the bell tower of our church. And they were responsible. I'm going to get ahead of myself into the more modern era for a second about the church. They were responsible for deeding an acre or two of land next to the church land so that a parsonage could be built. That was given to the church by the Jensens to build a parsonage around 1950 or so.
But Mel doesn't have his bow ties on there.
No, he doesn't have his bow tie. You worked with him a lot at Columbia Valley.
I did.
He worked there a long time too, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So if you continue from the corner east on the Bay Road, just to the first house on your left, and you won't really notice it because it's covered with trees in the front. It's back a ways. This is what it looks like now. But anyway, I brought this one up because this was the Beatty residence, and I only bring this up to remind me to tell you a story about how they settled in Pleasant Valley, because the Beattys were one of the very first ones to come out here on the Bay Road stretch of Pleasant Valley. In fact, there wasn't actually a way to get a wagon out here. There was really no road. Once you got north of Ferndale a little bit, you couldn't pull a wagon through the trees and the stumps and the mud to get onto the Bay Road. So how did they get their material up here to build a house? They had it shipped along the coastline from Bellingham up the California Creek, and then with a sled and oxen, he would pull many trips. He would pull his material or food supplies or whatever he needed in the very early days up to where they built, right almost across the road from us here. So he was really one of the pioneers here.
Cool.
There's also the story about 1879. He had a son who had an abscessed tooth. So Jim Beatty, he needed a dentist to treat this. So he walked from his home into Whatcom, which is part of downtown Bellingham now. He found a dentist. The dentist walked with him back to Pleasant Valley, back to their home, pulled the tooth. Beatty paid him the fee. It was $1. And then the dentist walked back again. I don't know if this was done over 2 or 3 day period. I don't know if the dentist really made out very well on that deal or not. But it was a different world. Yeah, walking. Everybody walked. Everybody walked. The last home I want to show you here, and then we'll get to do a little bit about Zion, is the Brown home. And some of you might kind of recognize this because the house is still there. If you're continuing east a little bit more, it's on the right side of the road. Mrs. Beatty was actually a Brown. She was born a Brown, and her brother Jim settled a couple of years later, and he built this beautiful house. And he wound up having 3 more brothers that lived in the area. 2 of them built right next door to him. One of them built just beyond his house. That was the Jack Hill's place for a long, long time. That was one of his brothers that built that house.
That's where Kempinski's lived.
This is where Kempinski's lived. That's exactly right. This is the great-grandson of Mr. Kempinski. He's about my age. He and his wife, they raised 2 kids. He's a great-grandson of Jim Brown that built this house. So it's been in the family all this time. The Hicks residence, the one right on the corner here, that's still in the family. And that may be about it for homes that are still surviving and still lived in by family. So, Zion, yeah, I wish I had more time because I get you all the way up to more current days, but we're going to talk about the early days a little bit. There started to be some interest in a Lutheran church a year or so before it officially was organized. And so people would meet in their homes, and finally they got a representative of the local Lutheran Synod to come out here, and so they eventually were organized, and it was actually on Thanksgiving Day. They had a Thursday. I checked the date to make sure it was a Thursday, and it was a Thursday, a Thanksgiving Day, that they had a service, and then they officially signed the papers after the service. Not here, but that comes in a second. But so that's how it got started. So where did they meet initially? We didn't have a building here right away. Well, initially they continued to worship in neighboring homes, usually kind of up that way, because some of the early founding members, or most of the very earliest founding members, kind of lived up south a little bit. So getting a pastor out was difficult, and pastors didn't come. Zion didn't have a pastor that called on a weekly basis until probably 1940. Up until then, they had a pastor who had maybe a 4, 5, or a 6-point parish, and he would hit maybe 3 of them one Sunday and the other 3 the next Sunday. So they would occasionally get a pastor come in here, and then finally they found a temporary home. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the first pastor was a guy named Ordal, and he was born in Norway. He came to the United States as a child. And so when he came here are some of the names that he ran into when he served here as the first pastor. And do you see any kind of a heritage flavor there in those names? Would you guess maybe they were Norwegians, like the pastor? Well, they sure were. They were about half of those names of the adult people. Probably half of them were actually born in Norway. Some of them were born in the States and meandered west, and they got a little older. So you had a lot of old hardcore Norwegians here, right at the very beginning. And so what did they call this place? Well, we weren't Zion from the very beginning. Here, this is a mouthful. We were known as the Emmanuel Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation near Ferndale, Washington. Now, you think that's a kind of a funny name, so they changed it. A couple of years later, they changed it. Here's what they changed it to. The Emmanuel Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church near Custer, Washington. That's all I can say about that. So the first temporary home they had was actually in a schoolhouse. And this is the first early schoolhouse. It was a grand view. There was another kind of a remodel of this later that didn't look anything like this. But this school appeared about 1904 for the school kids. And so they made a deal to lease for probably nothing the occasional Sunday service for the Emmanuel Lutheran Norwegian folks to gather here. So they did that for about 5 years. And then in 1905, we actually purchased this property. It's about 2 acres, and it cost $100. And a year later, we had our first death in the congregation, and the lady was buried right out here. I think she might be the first tall headstone to the right of the entrance out there. They streamlined building codes and building permits in those days. You would have loved it, Leonard, because they had all their plans worked up during the winter of 1909, and by March they were ready to go with construction. They had a plan, and they started building. They hired a guy who was their main contractor, the main builder. He did a lot of the work, but they had a lot of volunteers out here too. In fact, I think maybe even you might have had a father or a grandfather that might have even been out here and even helped. Is that right with the church?
Not. Well, Dad was here, I think, in the 20s. I got a grandfather buried out here in 1922.
Okay. That was your dad's father? Yeah. And then you have some on your mother's side, the Bergs.
Oh yeah.
Right, lots of Bergs that are out here. So Leonard has a really strong connection here. So the building was 50 foot long and 34 foot wide, and it cost a total. I don't know why we have all these records, but we have some pretty sharp records in the deep corners of the church. And it cost, they tallied everything up, and it was $1,288.42 for materials and labor. Now, we said the church, and we literally mean a church, because aside from folding chairs, there was nothing else in there except for a wood stove. They didn't have pews, altar, lamps, the baptismal font, or the Christ statue. So this is what it looked like early on. This is about the earliest picture we have.
And that's a $1,200 church. Huh?
Yeah. And you might notice there's actually an addendum or an addition here, and that was done probably in the 20s. Initially, it stopped right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lean-to back there.
Right. And we didn't have a basement then either. That came much later.
Yeah.
So this is the sanctuary, and you can kind of date it a little bit by 2 things. This is called the service flag, and this was in honor of the 9 men from the church who had served in World War I. So it's after World War I, but it's before electricity, it's before lights. These are oil lamps. So this is sometime in probably the 20s, from 1919 maybe to the late 20s, somewhere in there. And Rosemary, can you just tell us briefly what happened to the Christ statue and where it is today?
When we first started coming here, that statue was back here in the corner of the basement. It was moved upstairs. I don't exactly know when, but I do have something to tell you about the stand that it sits on upstairs. When you go up, take a look at that. I was in the church one day when I thought it was an earthquake. This building absolutely shook. Huge sound. In investigating with the guys what it came from, we had an old piano down here, and the inner workings of that piano broke. And it caused this whole building to shake. Well, what do you do with an old piano now that's broken? And so they were going to just discard everything. And we had a member, Ernie Heinrich, who said, don't get rid of the wood. And if you'll look, when you go upstairs under the statue, you will see it's built on a stand of wood. That's our old piano.
So we did a good job of recycling.
We did.
So, so it's one of the oldest artifacts we have still in the church, as well as the bell. I don't know when the bell appeared, but it's been there, probably 100 years or so now. So if you think, how did they communicate from the pulpit in the early years with all these Norwegians? Well, they spoke Norwegian from the pulpit. And here's another record that I could find. They used to record how the sermons were delivered each week. Were they in Norwegian or English? And somebody ran this collection for 30 years, to tell you. And so initially, we got here in 1909 in this building, and it was 9 years before you even heard one sermon in English. And that year you heard one sermon in English. So, like I say, you had old school Norwegian men in charge, pretty much still, and they wanted to preserve their heritage. You can't blame them for that. People still do that today. And so after 1918, English started to creep in a little bit more frequently, maybe once every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks for several years. And then in 1926, the council decided we're going to make it a 50-50. So that tells me that there was some contention going on those years by the younger people, probably. Or maybe people who argued, well, if we want to be inclusive to the greater neighborhood, maybe we should start talking in English. And so it started to slip more 50-50. And so in 1941, they said, okay, let's try this. Will you agree to this? Let's try all English for 1 year, and if you like it, that's the way it'll be. If you don't like it, we'll go back to 50-50. So they tried it, 1942, it's up for a vote, and it was almost unanimous. We even had vote counts that are recorded. It's amazing some of the history that you can still find. So from 42 on, it was all English from the pulpit. Although there were still some ladies' aids meetings for a few more years that they kept on the Norwegian language at their meetings. Leonard Kiner